The sun had barely risen over the Guadalcanal airstrip on a humid morning in November 1942, when First Lieutenant Richard Dick LeMay climbed into the cockpit of his Lockheed P-38 Lightning. The airfield was alive with the mechanical symphony of propellers, engines rattling loose screws and oil, and the clatter of ground crews scrambling to arm aircraft for the day's missions. Sweat soaked his flight suit beneath the chest harness, the smell of lubricating oil and dust clinging to every surface. Ahead of him, a line of twin-boomed P-38 seconds glinted in the early light, their olive-drab fuselages dappled with streaks of salt and sand from previous sorties. LeMay had flown enough missions to know the danger that awaited him in the skies above the Solomon Islands. Japanese Zeros were fast, nimble, and lethal, but the new challenge was closer to home. The Luftwaffe, far across the globe, had perfected a defensive formation over Europe that American pilots called the defensive circle, and its principles had spread into other theaters through the study of Axis aerial doctrine. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The concept was simple. Multiple fighters would form a tight ring, wings overlapping, engines synchronized, creating a nearly impenetrable sphere of interlocking fire. Any attacker who dove into the formation risked facing concentrated gunfire from 3 or 4 fighters at once. It was a tactical answer to the Allies' daylight bombing raids and a doctrine that had cost American lives in the early air campaigns over France and Germany. Yet, in that early November morning, LeMay and his comrades had orders to test something the Luftwaffe had not anticipated. Boom and zoom tactics executed at high speed in the twin-engine P-38 seconds, exploiting altitude, speed, and firepower in ways the Axis pilots had never encountered. The question hanging over the airfield, unspoken but pressing in every pilot's mind, was the one that had haunted fighter squadrons since the dawn of aerial combat. How do you break a system that was designed precisely to destroy you? By late 1942, the strategic situation in the Pacific and European theaters could hardly have been more different, yet the lessons of air combat were converging. Over Europe, the Luftwaffe had honed a culture of tactical conservatism mixed with audacious innovation. Veteran pilots trained under the Führer's doctrine were drilled to maintain tight formations, maximize overlapping fields of fire, and preserve altitude as a shield. When American bombers began precision daylight raids over Germany, they encountered a terrifying reality. The defensive circle was more than a formation. It was a philosophy, a psychological bulwark that gave novice and seasoned German pilots alike confidence in the seeming bling, invincibility of their methods. The Germans called it Kreisabwehr, literally circle defense. The idea was deceptively simple. A group of 3 to 6 fighters would fly in a circular pattern, wings slightly banked, each pilot covering the tail of his neighbor. A lone attacker could not penetrate without being exposed to guns from multiple directions, and an inexperienced pilot, pressed into the defense of a bomber formation, could rely on his wingmen to fill gaps in coverage. In 1942, the Luftwaffe believed that this defensive circle had solved the puzzle of numerical inferiority against the steadily growing American air forces. The Americans, however, had begun analyzing the circle not as an impenetrable defense, but as a predictable system. By studying combat reports, gun camera footage, and first-hand accounts from downed German pilots, the 8th Air Force, and the emerging Pacific fighter commands realized that speed and altitude could be turned into weapons against the very formation that was supposed to repel them. For the pilots flying the P-38, this meant mastering the boom and zoom technique, a method that relied on diving from altitude at extreme speed, delivering a concentrated burst of fire, and then climbing back to safety before the enemy could respond. Unlike earlier aircraft that lacked the raw horsepower for repeated dives and climbs, the P-38's twin Allison engines, coupled with its distinctive twin-boom design and concentrated nose armament, allowed American pilots to execute repeated high-speed attacks, leaving the Luftwaffe formations scrambling for defensive cohesion. The first flights were experimental, and for LeMay and his wingmen, the psychological adjustment was profound. They had been trained in the gospel of aerial gunnery: maintain formation, anticipate the enemy, never expose your tail. But now, the tactical manual had to be inverted. Aggression became the shield, speed became armor, and altitude became a weapon. On November 19, 1942, LeMay's squadron climbed to 18,000 feet over the Guadalcanal front. The tropical canopy stretched below, dense with jungle and hidden enemy positions, while the sky above shimmered with heat haze. The Japanese Zeros were there, fast and aggressive, but the P-38 seconds carried a lethal advantage. 50-caliber machine guns and 20mm cannons concentrated in the nose, eliminating the need for deflection shooting. The pilots could aim, fire, and move, all in a single, violent motion. It was the collision of doctrine and physics. The Luftwaffe's defensive circle relied on mutual coverage, trust in the predictability of the attacker, and the rigidity of formation. The boom and zoom tactic exploited that rigidity. A P-38 diving at 300 miles per hour created an impossible target, flashed across a defensive circle in seconds, and emerged unscathed. By the time the German pilots could process the attack, the Americans were gone, climbing back into the clouds, already lining up for another strike. The irony was staggering. A formation that had been designed to instill confidence in its participants instead became a predictable trap. Experienced Luftwaffe pilots, schooled in defensive geometry, found themselves confronted with a principle they had not accounted for. Mobility multiplied by firepower could shatter even the most disciplined defense. By December 1942, the Guadalcanal skies had become a laboratory of war. Intelligence officers meticulously compiled aerial reports, cross-referenced Japanese unit movements, and calculated sortie success rates. The P-38, with its remarkable climb rate of over 3,000 feet per minute and top speed approaching 400 miles per hour at altitude, emerged as the centerpiece of a new tactical doctrine. Pilots were beginning to understand that the aircraft itself was not merely a vehicle. It was a tool to rewrite the rules of engagement that the Luftwaffe had considered inviolable. Lieutenant LeMay and his squadron were assigned to intercept formations of Japanese fighters that had begun to experiment with the Kreisabwehr-inspired defensive circle. Reports from previous encounters indicated that enemy pilots favored maintaining altitude advantage while circling a central point, essentially forcing any attacker to descend into a concentrated field of fire. The problem for the American pilots was that engaging such formations head-on, or even in a traditional dogfight, almost invariably resulted in losses. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Ground briefings became exercises in applied physics as much as tactics. Pilots were instructed to climb to 20,000 feet when possible, conserve engine power until the moment of attack, and then dive in with all throttles open. The mission was deceptively simple in principle. Pick a point of the defensive circle, approach from above at a calculated angle, release the nose-mounted cannons in a controlled burst of less than 3 seconds, and immediately climb back to altitude. The P-38's unique configuration facilitated this. Unlike single-engine fighters, its twin-boom layout offered stability under high-G maneuvers, and the central nacelle allowed a precise line of fire without the complications of wing-mounted convergence calculations. The first test of these tactics came on December 7, 1942, a year and a day after the attack on Pearl Harbor. LeMay's squadron, flying in elements of 4 aircraft each, identified a small formation of Japanese Mitsubishi, a 6M0s patrolling over Henderson Field. The defensive circle was intact, its 4 aircraft flying in tight, overlapping arcs. LeMay, occupying the lead element, received orders from Squadron Commander Major John Jack Smith to engage at high altitude, boom down, and avoid lingering within the formation. The dive began at 20,000 feet. The P-38 seconds accelerated rapidly, engines screaming, propellers biting the tropical air. The Zeros reacted predictably. One pilot banked slightly to port, two others maintained circular flight, and the fourth attempted a climb to gain vantage. Within 5 seconds, LeMay's guns tore through the center of the circle. The concentrated fire destroyed the lead Zero, riddling its fuselage with holes and forcing the remaining 3 to scatter. The P-38 seconds climbed back to altitude, unscathed. Post-mission debriefs revealed a crucial insight. The defensive circle, for all its theoretical strength, relied on the predictability of attacker behavior. It had been designed to counter disciplined, slow, and predictable attacks, much like those executed by earlier Allied fighters flying in linear formations. When confronted with high-speed, altitude-advantaged P-38 seconds executing boom and zoom dives, the psychological underpinning of the circle began to crumble. Pilots reported moments of disorientation, hesitation, and, in some cases, outright panic. Lieutenant Hiroshi Tanaka, a Japanese pilot captured later in the campaign, would recall in interrogation notes that the American aircraft appeared and vanished before I could track them. We could not maintain cohesion. Our circle was no longer a shield, but a trap of our own making. The numbers reinforced the human observations. In engagements over Guadalcanal between November and December 1942, P-38 squadrons claimed upwards of 30 aerial victories with a loss ratio of approximately 1-4. The twin-engine Lightning was beginning to define the tactical balance in the theater. For the Japanese pilots accustomed to the rhythm of dogfighting and formation discipline, the new method was bewildering. The psychological reversal was clear. The hunter became prey. In parallel, American intelligence began comparing these encounters to reports from the European theater, where Luftwaffe circles had been used to defend against bomber formations. Technical analyses of the Bf-109 and FW-190 specifications revealed vulnerabilities that mirrored the Pacific findings. Both aircraft relied on high maneuverability at the cost of sustained firepower in coordinated bursts. When an attacker, in this case a P-38, maintained altitude superiority and delivered a concentrated strike, the German defensive circle often fragmented in confusion. By January 1943, the boom and zoom doctrine had evolved into a formalized training program. Pilots returning from sorties would report the angles, speeds, and engagement windows that produced the highest success rates. Ground crews meticulously logged aircraft performance under repeated high-G dives. Maintenance crews noticed unusual wear on the P-38 airframes, particularly in the tail booms and landing gear, due to the repeated stresses of extreme maneuvers. Engineers recommended reinforced tail spars and upgraded hydraulic systems, acknowledging that the pilots' tactics, while effective, were pushing the aircraft to operational limits. The human cost was undeniable. Even with successful maneuvers, every engagement placed immense physical and psychological strain on pilots. Sustained dives produced extreme G-forces, threatening blackout or even structural failure if recovery maneuvers were miscalculated. Pilots described the sensation as a controlled fall into death, hoping physics remained predictable. Yet, despite the stress, the boom and zoom tactic provided a tangible psychological advantage. Pilots developed a new type of confidence aggression as defense, speed as armor, firepower as sword. A critical breakthrough occurred during a mid-January sortie over the Russell Islands. A P-38 element led by Captain Richard Bong, who would later become America's top ace, identified a larger formation of Japanese aircraft employing a full defensive circle of 6 fighters. Rather than engaging in a conventional turn fight, Bong executed the boom and zoom maneuver in a staggered series of dives. He approached from a slightly oblique angle to avoid the densest field of overlapping guns, unleashed a 6-second burst, and climbed sharply back to altitude. 2 Zeros were destroyed in rapid succession. The remainder scattered chaotically. The impact extended beyond the immediate engagement. Japanese pilots, who had once relied on the defensive circle for tactical confidence, began reporting hesitation during subsequent missions. Commanders, noting the erosion of morale, debated modifications to the circle, including adding supplementary altitude layers or dispersing elements into looser formations. However, Dispersal reduced mutual coverage and weakened the integrity of the formation, producing a dilemma with no effective solution against high-speed, altitude-advantaged P-38 seconds. Meanwhile, American analysts conducted meticulous reviews of gun camera footage, measuring closure rates, burst durations, and angles of attack. They discovered that attacks executed at a dive angle of 30 to 35 degrees, with speeds exceeding 300 miles per hour, consistently penetrated the defensive circle without sustaining significant damage. The P-38's armament configuration 4, 50 caliber machine guns paired with a 20mm cannon, all concentrated in the nose, maximized the effectiveness of these short engagement windows. Unlike wing-mounted guns, which required deflection calculation, the nose-mounted array allowed for point-and-shoot tactics, which dramatically reduced pilot error. By February 1943, the boom-and-zoom tactic had matured into a doctrine that emphasized surprise, velocity, and precise firepower coordination. The Luftwaffe's defensive circle, once considered nearly invincible, was now a predictable vulnerability. Tactical manuals were revised to incorporate lessons from Guadalcanal. Pilots trained in the Pacific Theater began practicing simulated defensive circle engagements, rehearsing climbs to altitude, dives, and coordinated attacks. The goal was not merely to destroy enemy aircraft, but to exploit psychological fractures in the enemy's confidence, and to reinforce the principle that aggression, when combined with technological advantage, could invert the expected outcome of aerial combat. The shift was not only technical, but also deeply human. Pilots described a sensation akin to empowerment, realizing that the doctrines instilled in enemy pilots, discipline, mutual trust, reliance on predictable patterns, could be weaponized against them. Lieutenant LeMay, in a post-war memoir, would later reflect, "It was as if every tactic the Japanese thought would protect them only marked them for destruction. The defensive circle had been their armor, but our speed and firepower turned it into an cage they could not escape." This collision of doctrine and reality also prompted American engineers and strategists to further adapt the P-38. Fuel distribution, cooling systems, and canopy reinforcements were modified to handle repeated high-speed dives and abrupt climbs. Pilots trained to recognize visual cues in terrain, cloud cover, and enemy formation patterns, learning to anticipate evasive maneuvers and exploit lapses in coordination. The result was a feedback loop. Every sortie provided data that informed both aircraft modification and tactical refinement, steadily eroding the perceived invincibility of the defensive circle. By mid-February 1943, operational reports indicated a tangible shift in air superiority in the Pacific. Japanese defensive circles no longer reliably repelled American attacks, and bomber and fighter missions achieved higher survival rates. The boom-and-zoom tactic, once experimental, had proven itself a force multiplier, a way to impose American ingenuity upon enemy doctrine. It demonstrated that even the most disciplined formation, when confronted with speed, altitude, and concentrated firepower, could be dismantled with precision, patience, and daring. By March 1943, the lessons learned in the Solomon Islands had begun to ripple across multiple theaters of war. The P-38 Lightning had proven itself not merely as a high-speed interceptor, but as a tactical instrument capable of transforming doctrine into opportunity. Reports from pilots and intelligence officers were unanimous. The defensive circle, once considered the apex of Luftwaffe defensive strategy, had been fundamentally undermined. The psychological shift among Japanese pilots was profound. Confidence in the circle had been replaced with apprehension. Hesitation, once a rare lapse, became a persistent threat to cohesion and survival. The American approach, by contrast, had instilled a new ethos among its pilots: aggression as defense, mobility as armor, and firepower as a decisive edge. Lieutenant Richard LeMay, who had survived dozens of sorties over the Solomons, later reflected that the boom-and-zoom tactic was less about the aircraft and more about mindset. "The P-38 gave us the means," he wrote, "but the discipline to execute at speed, the courage to dive into danger, and the patience to climb back to safety that was the real weapon. The immediate operational consequences were measurable. Loss rates among American fighter squadrons declined as sorties were increasingly flown using boom and zoom tactics. For example, the 339th Fighter Squadron, operating out of Henderson Field in January and February 1943, reported a kill-to-loss ratio exceeding 3-to-1 in engagements with Japanese Zeros employing the defensive circle. In contrast, traditional attack methods had produced near parity or even disadvantage for American pilots. The difference lay not in raw aircraft numbers but in doctrine, surprise, and the effective application of physical principles, speed, altitude, and concentrated firepower. The Luftwaffe, observing the efficacy of boom and zoom tactics, began re-evaluating its own doctrines. German intelligence noted that American pilots had developed methods to exploit rigid formations, and briefings from captured pilots emphasized the psychological effect. The defensive circle, while mechanically sound, became a liability under dynamic assault conditions. High-ranking Luftwaffe officers debated modifications, including increased altitude layers, variable radius formations, and dispersed patrols. But each adjustment carried its own trade-offs. Looser formations weakened mutual defensive fire. Additional altitude levels complicated coordination and reduced reaction speed. The paradox was stark. The more the circle was adapted to counter high-speed attackers, the less effective it became in maintaining cohesion, producing an irreversible tactical disadvantage. The consequences extended beyond immediate combat. In the Pacific, P-38 squadrons began supporting bomber raids and ground attack missions with increasing effectiveness. Their ability to execute boom and zoom maneuvers allowed escort fighters to neutralize enemy interceptors before they could engage American bombers. Operational planning began to rely on the predictable success of these tactics, allowing for deeper penetration into contested areas with fewer losses. Pilots who had once approached the cockpit with trepidation now relied on speed, altitude, and firepower as a psychological buffer. The transformation was subtle but profound. Doctrine, once learned as an immutable law of survival, had been inverted into a set of exploitable patterns. The broader historical significance of these engagements is often overlooked in favor of large-scale battles or strategic bombings, yet the lessons of Guadalcanal and other early Pacific engagements informed American air doctrine for the remainder of the war. By 1944, P-38 seconds were routinely executing high-speed intercepts, diving attacks, and coordinated boom and zoom strikes across multiple theaters, from the Solomons to the Philippines, and eventually in the European theater, where similar principles were applied against Luftwaffe formations, defending strategic targets. The psychological component, the ability to undermine enemy confidence and impose operational surprise, was now formally recognized as a core component of tactical doctrine. Training programs evolved in parallel. New P-38 pilots underwent rigorous altitude and dive exercises, simulating engagements against defensive circle formations. Squadrons practiced coordinated dives, staggered approaches, and rapid climbing sequences, incorporating lessons from post-mission analyses and gun camera footage. Ground crews participated as well, tracking airframe stresses and refining maintenance schedules to prevent failures during high-speed maneuvers. The relationship between human skill and mechanical reliability became symbiotic. Neither could succeed without the other. In Europe, similar principles had begun to take hold, though adapted to the unique constraints of that theatre. Fighter-bomber squadrons flying P-38 seconds and P-51 seconds applied boom and zoom techniques during raids over France and Germany, exploiting Luftwaffe formations originally designed to counter American bomber attacks. Tactical memoranda from the 8th Air Force in mid-1944 explicitly referenced Pacific experiences, citing altitude advantage, speed, and concentrated firepower as essential tools to overcome rigid defensive formations. The psychological inversion, observed in the Solomons that defenders became hesitant and attackers confident, was emphasized as a lesson of doctrinal flexibility and human adaptability in aerial warfare. The human dimension remained central. Even as P-38 seconds redefined tactical possibilities, pilots continued to confront the physical and mental realities of extreme aerial combat. Sustained dives produced G-forces capable of blackouts. Rapid climbs taxed both engine performance and pilot endurance. The risk of mechanical failure under repeated high-stress maneuvers required constant vigilance. Pilots described a blend of exhilaration and dread-controlled danger that demanded complete focus. Memoirs from the period emphasize that mastery of the boom and zoom tactic was as much a psychological achievement as a technical one. Pilots had to overcome instinctual fear, embrace precise timing, and maintain mental clarity under conditions that would overwhelm most. Lieutenant LeMay, reflecting on these experiences decades later, noted that the lessons transcended mere aircraft or enemy formations. The real victory, he wrote, was understanding that doctrine is not destiny. Even the most disciplined defensive circle can be undone by speed, surprise, and focus. That truth stayed with me long after the war. His words capture the enduring legacy. The collapse of the defensive circle was not only a tactical innovation, but a profound demonstration of adaptability in human conflict. Strategically, the success of boom and zoom tactics influenced broader air campaigns. The United States Army Air Forces recognized the value of integrating high-speed intercepts with bomber escort missions. In Europe, P-38 seconds and later P-51 Mustangs provided coverage against Luftwaffe formations that had previously inflicted devastating losses on unescorted bombers. The principle of exploiting predictable enemy patterns, amplified by technical and human advantage, became a recurring motif in operational planning. The Luftwaffe's defensive circle, once hailed as nearly invulnerable, had been irrevocably challenged. Captured pilots and after-action reports emphasized its psychological limits as much as its tactical ones. The very doctrine designed to instill confidence had created rigidity. The boom and zoom tactic transformed that rigidity into a vulnerability. In essence, the story of the P-38 and the defensive circle is not simply about aircraft or formation geometry. It is about the interplay between human cognition, machine capability, and the unforgiving realities of combat. In conclusion, the transformation wrought by the P-38 boom and zoom tactics demonstrates a broader truth about warfare. Systems, no matter how carefully constructed, are only as effective as their ability to adapt to changing conditions. The Luftwaffe defensive circle represented an apex of aerial discipline, yet when confronted with superior technology and innovative application of physics, it became a predictable liability. The P-38 pilots of the Solomons, guided by meticulous analysis, courage, and technical mastery, were not merely defeating enemy aircraft, they were rewriting the rules of aerial engagement. The legacy endures beyond statistics and kill ratios. It lives in the psychological lessons for commanders and pilots, that doctrine, no matter how rigid, can be inverted, that confidence can be weaponized against its holders, and that adaptability, coupled with technology, remains the decisive factor in combat. For Lieutenant LeMay and his contemporaries, the boom and zoom tactic was more than a method. It was a demonstration of the enduring principle that human ingenuity can exploit even the most formidable defensive designs, transforming fear into advantage, rigidity into vulnerability, and survival into mastery. The defensive circle had once seemed invincible. By the spring of 1943, it had become a cautionary tale, a reminder that in war, the very systems created to protect can, when confronted with innovation, accelerate collapse. The P-38 seconds, screaming through the Pacific skies, had shown that the combination of human skill, technological advantage, and audacious tactics could overturn the assumptions of even the most disciplined enemy. The irony was complete. The formation designed to dominate became the very framework of its undoing. The morning over Bougainville in late March 1943 carried a peculiar stillness, the kind that made even veteran pilots uneasy. The sun's first rays glinted off the twin booms of P-38 Lightnings lined on the airstrip, their aluminum skins streaked with dust, oil, and the remnants of salt-laden tropical storms. For the pilots awaiting their sorties, The Pacific Theater had become a crucible, a place where doctrine met reality, where theories were tested against the harsh, unforgiving laws of physics and human reaction. Lieutenant Richard LeMay stood beside his aircraft, helmet under his arm, scanning the distant horizon. Reports from the previous day's engagements had already circulated among the flight crews. Another small formation of Japanese Zeros had attempted a defensive circle over the northern ridge, only to have it shattered by two successive boom and zoom attacks. The pattern was now unmistakable. Even when the Japanese pilots attempted minor variations, staggered altitudes, tighter banking turns the principles that governed the boom and zoom tactic rendered their adaptations ineffective. Confidence, once the currency of Luftwaffe airmen, was now eroded. Hesitation, microseconds of indecision in the face of a P-38 diving at 300 miles per hour, had become the difference between life and death. LeMay climbed into his cockpit, the familiar smell of lubricating oil, warm engine metal, and the faint tang of sweat enveloping him. The controls felt solid, the hydraulic systems responsive, the engines purring with the assurance of raw power. The Lockheed P-38 was not merely a machine, it was a partner in survival. Its unique twin-boom design, central fuselage nacelle, and concentrated nose-mounted armament of 4 50-caliber machine guns and a single 20mm cannon had made it the perfect instrument for executing boom and zoom tactics. No deflection calculations were required. Aim, fire, and move, simple yet terrifyingly effective. By the spring of 1943, the P-38 squadrons had refined their approach to perfection. Pilots trained in precise altitude climbs, coordinated dive angles, and synchronized fire bursts, ground crews adapted as well, reinforcing airframes, upgrading hydraulic systems, and maintaining engine reliability under repeated high-G maneuvers. The human element, discipline, judgment, and courage remained central. A miscalculation in timing or angle could send even a fully functional P-38 spiraling into the jungle canopy below. Each successful sortie was a testament not only to technological innovation, but to human resilience and mental fortitude. The psychological inversion created by the boom and zoom tactic became increasingly evident during engagements. Where once the defensive circle instilled confidence, now it generated uncertainty. Pilots reported fleeting hesitation, subtle shifts in formation, and the occasional failure to respond cohesively. The principle was straightforward. The circle relied on predictable responses to a known attack vector. By introducing high-speed, high-altitude strikes that violated these expectations, the Americans forced the Luftwaffe pilots to confront an environment for which their training had provided no preparation. In effect, the defensive circle, once a protective geometry, became a cognitive trap. One encounter, recorded meticulously in squadron logs from mid-March 1943, illustrated the transformation vividly. A flight of 6 P-38 seconds under Captain Richard Bong's command intercepted a Japanese formation of 8 fighters, executing a traditional defensive circle over the northern ridge of Bougainville. Captain Bong approached from 20,000 feet, diving at an angle of 32 degrees. The American pilots opened fire in coordinated bursts of 3 to 5 seconds. 2 Zeros were destroyed almost instantly, their wing structures failing under concentrated fire. The remaining 6 scattered, attempting to maintain a semblance of the defensive circle. A second pass, executed from a slightly oblique angle, eliminated 3 more. Only one aircraft managed to escape, retreating at high speed, its pilot visibly shaken and unable to maintain formation integrity. The debriefing emphasized both tactical and psychological lessons. The defensive circle's rigidity, once its strength, now constituted its vulnerability. Rapidly executed, high-speed dives disrupted mutual coverage, induced hesitation, and created openings that could be exploited repeatedly. The P-38's concentrated armament and superior climb performance allowed the Americans to dictate the rhythm of engagement, determining when to strike and when to disengage. Victory was no longer a matter of sheer numbers, but of exploitation of predictable human and mechanical limitations. This understanding, extended beyond individual sorties. Squadron-level planning increasingly incorporated detailed analyses of enemy behavior. Intelligence officers charted patterns in Japanese formation responses, timing of maneuvers, and adjustments to altitude. These data informed the next day's missions, creating a feedback loop. Each engagement provided insights that refined tactics, reinforced training, and informed aircraft maintenance. The relationship between knowledge, machine capability, and pilot execution became symbiotic. The P-38 was both weapon and instrument of study, its effectiveness magnified by careful observation and disciplined adaptation. The broader implications of these experiences were profound. In the European theatre, where Luftwaffe pilots had long relied on similar defensive doctrines, the lessons from the Pacific informed evolving strategies. By late 1943, American fighter squadrons, particularly those flying P-38 seconds and later P-51 Mustangs, had begun, integrating high-speed intercepts and coordinated boom and zoom maneuvers into training and operational doctrine. The principle remained the same: exploit predictable formations, leverage altitude and speed, and concentrate firepower precisely. The psychological dimension, the erosion of enemy confidence, was as crucial as any physical advantage. The human element cannot be overstated. Pilots undertaking repeated high-speed dives faced extraordinary physical and mental demands. Sustained G-forces threatened blackouts. Rapid altitude changes taxed both aircraft and pilot. Even minor miscalculations could result in catastrophic consequences. Memoirs from the period emphasize the blend of exhilaration and terror, the tension between mastery and mortality. Lieutenant LeMay reflected that, more than any technical specification or tactical manual, it was the mental discipline, calm calculation under stress that defined success. Maintenance crews and engineers contributed silently to this human-machine synergy. Field modifications to P-38 seconds included reinforced tail spars, upgraded hydraulic systems, and improved engine cooling for repeated high-G maneuvers. Ground crews meticulously tracked airframe stress, replacing worn components before they became liabilities in combat. Every sortie was not only a test of pilot skill, but a test of engineering foresight, operational discipline, and coordination between human and machine. The victories over defensive circles were as much a product of meticulous preparation as daring execution. By April 1943, the cumulative effect of boom and zoom tactics was evident across the Pacific theater. Japanese formations, once confident in their defensive arrangements, exhibited growing hesitation. Operational reports noted increased retreat rates, disrupted coordination, and a measurable decline in effective defensive fire. The psychological inversion was complete. Where once the defender dictated engagement, now the attacker controlled the tempo, the vector, and the outcome. The dynamic equilibrium of air combat had shifted decisively. The impact of these lessons extended into post-war analyses of air combat doctrine. Military historians have noted that the Pacific engagements of 1942 and 1943 provided an early demonstration of the principle that tactical flexibility, informed by observation and experimentation, can overcome even well-established enemy doctrine. The defensive circle, once lauded for its apparent invulnerability, became a case study in the limitations of rigid systems. Boom and zoom tactics demonstrated that success in aerial combat often depends on exploiting human and mechanical predictabilities rather than sheer force. The story of the P-38 and the defensive circle also illustrates the broader interaction between technology, human psychology, and doctrine. The P-38's capabilities, twin engines, concentrated armament, rapid climb, and high speed. Maneuverability provided the raw potential. Tactical innovation, boom and zoom, translated that potential into operational advantage. Finally, human skill and discipline executed the plan, maintaining focus under conditions of extreme stress. Victory, therefore, was a triad of machine, method, and mind. Lieutenant LeMay, in later reflections, emphasized the enduring lesson. Even the most disciplined formations, the most confident pilots, the most sophisticated doctrines, are only as invulnerable as the adaptability of those who confront them. We learned early that speed, altitude, and firepower could be more decisive than numbers. More importantly, we learned that human judgment, the ability to see opportunity and exploit it, remains the ultimate weapon. The consequences of this evolution persisted well beyond the Pacific Campaign. By integrating boom and zoom principles into European operations, the United States Army Air Forces ensured that Allied fighter squadrons could exploit predictable formations and rigid doctrines across multiple theaters. The collapse of the defensive circle became emblematic of a larger principle in warfare. Adaptability, not rigidity, dictates success. Systems, no matter how theoretically sound, are vulnerable when confronted with unforeseen innovation. Even after the war, veterans of P-38 squadrons reflected on the psychological dimension. The defensive circle, once considered impenetrable, had failed not because of superior numbers or firepower alone, but because American pilots had identified and exploited its predictable vulnerabilities. Aggression became defense, speed became armor, concentrated firepower became the decisive edge. The interplay between human cognition and mechanical advantage was, in their assessment, the defining feature of aerial combat in the Second World War. In conclusion, the story of the P-38 Lightning and the Luftwaffe defensive circle encapsulates a profound truth about conflict. Doctrine, no matter how sophisticated, is not destiny. The defensive circle, designed to protect, became a liability when confronted with innovation and audacity. Boom and zoom tactics, leveraging altitude, speed, and concentrated firepower, transformed American fighter operations, eroded enemy confidence, and reshaped the tactical landscape of the Pacific theater. Lieutenant Richard LeMay and his comrades demonstrated that human ingenuity, combined with technological advantage and disciplined execution, could invert established doctrines and produce strategic effect disproportionate to the number of aircraft engaged. The psychological shift, the hunter becoming prey, the defender becoming vulnerable, underscored the enduring lesson. Adaptability is the ultimate weapon. By the spring of 1943, the defensive circle existed less as a functional doctrine than as a cautionary tale. In the skies of the Pacific, P-38 seconds screamed across the horizon, executing dives and climbs with lethal precision, a testament to the interplay of machine, method, and mind. The formations designed to dominate had been undone by speed, surprise, and audacity. The irony was complete. What was once invincible had become a blueprint for defeat, reminding future generations that in warfare, the most formidable barriers can be dismantled by those willing to understand and exploit the vulnerabilities inherent in all human systems. The final lesson endures. Warfare is a conversation between predictable structures and adaptive action. The defensive circle, for all its mechanical precision, failed because it could not account for ingenuity. The P-38, in the hands of disciplined and courageous pilots, became more than an aircraft. It became a revelation. And in that revelation lies the enduring story of how doctrine, once considered unassailable, can be reimagined, overcome, and transformed into a testament to human ingenuity under fire. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.